Hi, welcome to Teaching Basics 101. Today's topic is that of assessment. I'm Sean Horning. I've been teaching in public education for 20 years at the secondary level, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today about how we find evidence for and of learning, and that lies at the heart of assessment. When we think assessment, we think of evidence, and we think of evidence for learning. What do we need for the student to be successful along the way? And we'll talk about that. That usually falls into the category of formative assessment, evidence for learning as we're going through our course of study. And then we think about evidence of learning. That's oftentimes looking back on what we've covered and how well did we retain it? What can we show with regard to the skills that we're being tasked with? And what type of competencies are we meeting with regard to the course objectives? One thing that I would like you to keep in mind that is very important when we talk about this idea of assessment is that you are the lead learner in your classroom space. And when we talk about that, whether that space be one with no ceilings or one with no walls, wherever you meet and have the opportunity to learn with your students, you are the lead learner. And when we really talk about assessment, that allows us to provide feedback. And feedback to me is so critical because it is about the love of learning. So we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of different types of assessment. We're going to talk about not necessarily the type, but more of the function of assessment. Just as learning is more verb than noun, when we think assessments, I want us to think about what do we want the assessment to provide? What type of information do we want to find out with regard to student learning? And when we talk about feedback and love of learning, we're going to take a look at the idea that feedback should be frequent, it should be timely, and it should be meaningful. And if we're able to provide that feedback, oftentimes from the information that we receive from the assessments that we provide the students, it really cements our place as the lead learner, and it shows our love of learning, and it cements the idea that we're there for the students along their learning process. Let's go ahead and take a look at the functions of assessment. What you'll hear most is this idea of formative assessment and summative. I like to think of it more so as that which is process-driven and prospective in nature. And those two forms that we'll talk about would be the formative and the diagnostic. And then if we're looking at the more summative, the retrospective, the product-based, where are we at in this moment, at this point in time, and evidence of learning. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that, which is prospective. Okay. If we talk about formative assessments, those are those assessments that are there with the purpose of improving. They should be built in along the way as we're going along the learning process, the course of study, as we're demonstrating skills. Those formative assessments provide those checkpoints, provide those pieces along the way that inform us and help us know where the student has areas to improve upon. It also shows us where the students are having great successes and maybe where that student understands the information and wants to go down a little bit further into their inquiry into the subject matter. And so those are those formative pieces that show us about improving. Another form of formative assessment is that which is diagnostic. If we have students that are struggling in the moment and they're experiencing difficulties in their learning, those are the times where we can provide formative assessments to show maybe where their difficulties are, where they have special needs for them to be successful, and how we can help them overcome those obstacles so they can be more successful in their learning process. And so that's what the formative piece is. Primarily, it's prospective. It's about the process of learning.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Lori Levine here from Kansas State University. I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you for being interested in the teaching profession, and thank you for all you are doing to serve students and your community. If you don't yet have your bachelor's degree in education and you're seeking teacher licensure, I would invite you to check out our Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education online degree. This is a powerful, fully accredited program taught by faculty at Kansas State University. This online program is available to anyone in all 50 states as well as internationally. We make transferring credits into K-State easy, and we have a number of generous scholarships, grants, and financial aid available. We pride ourselves on teaching strong pedagogical practices, having close relationships with our students, and peer support as you start your teaching career. You can check out more information about our award-winning program by visiting the website listed below. Thank you.
Now we'll talk a little bit about the summative piece, which is more retrospective, and that's usually to convey achievement. Where did they meet those objectives, those core competencies? Did they meet those? Did they produce those things that they're being asked to produce? Can they demonstrate understanding in that time period when we talk about summative assessments? And then oftentimes assessments in education are used to evaluate curriculum, institutional-based things that may be implemented district-wide that are programmatic, and that's evaluating, did learning take place? This isn't my analogy, but one way to think about formative assessment is the cook tasting the soup. I've heard formative assessment is where the cook tastes the soup before serving it. The summative part is where the customer tastes the soup. And the one thing that I want us to also remember is we got to make sure that it's the student that's doing the cooking. Ultimately, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but ultimately we want the student to be the one who is tasting the soup and evaluating if it needs more here or if it needs a little bit of seasoning here. What do we need to do to make this soup more successful? And if we're using the analogy, the soup is the learning. Let's talk a little bit about the formative piece as we're setting up learning. The first thing that you'll want to do is define the course of study. Define and make sure that the objectives are clear. What are we trying to learn? What are we trying to demonstrate? What are we trying to be able to complete or accomplish? And those competencies and objectives, if we know that to begin with, that's where we'll start. Then as we start laying out lesson plans and how best to deliver the information and how best to assess student learning, we need to make sure that we're building in those pieces for students to be able to show at a time where they're at this given time period and what can we do to better inform, to better understand what we're doing along the way. And these are those formative pieces. For my money, the best type of formative assessment are those which are self-evaluative and self-reflective. It invites them to be more better questioners, and it allows them to really be a part of the process where they really understand that their education is theirs. The other thing too, and this comes with reading the room, so to speak, we used to call it with-itness, is if we're in the process of learning and engaging in the classroom and we have those moments where we feel like, maybe the students aren't quite getting this, or maybe there's questions about what we're doing here. Don't feel pressure to move forward. Don't feel pressure to move through so you can get through the lesson. Don't miss out on those moments to be in the moment with your students and engaging them in the learning. And then finally, the one thing I love about formative assessments is it gives opportunities for more success along the way. We have those opportunities to celebrate, to exhibit success, and that we're not quite there yet, but there's that grit, there's that stick-to-itiveness that we want. And it's okay if we fall a little bit, as long as we're falling forward and we're learning from those things. And that's that formative piece where we can discuss the learning process as we go. Now let's talk a little bit about the summative piece. And oftentimes when we think of assessment, this is that traditional test of knowledge. This is where we are producing a finished product or exhibiting our understanding. This is for the evidence of learning. And one thing that I would try to stress here is that your best summative assessments are those that are multidimensional, that allow students to express and exhibit understanding or produce in a way that makes sense to their learning style, where they can still meet those objectives, where they can still exhibit those competencies that you want for your course of study, but it honors their learning style and it shows them that they're able to produce and provide evidence in a way that makes sense to them and also makes sense for the learning that you're engaging with. Ultimately, whatever form of assessment that you land on, it's based on successful learning. So how do we show that they've learned it? How do they show you that they've learned it? How do we engage in this dialogue about learning? And that's this piece of assessment that often gets lost, is this dialogue and feedback piece. One thing that I would stress about summative assessments are that even though they may be something that is cumulative in nature or something that is a synopsis of learning, oftentimes it is also formative in the sense that there may be a deadline, but sometimes you can back that deadline up. Okay, so you can back it up a little bit before. Say a student has a project that she or he is producing, and here's the due date. Provide a couple weeks before where they can exhibit their piece, where they can get feedback from someone other than just the teacher. Maybe their classmates can comment on, have you thought about this? Invite community members and their parents where they can get that feedback so they can tweak the product, so they can produce something in a way that will be more successful that maybe they hadn't thought of, but that dialogue with other members of the learning community will provide them opportunities to be more successful and show them that they're really, that their learning and what they are learning is important to not just them, but to the learning community. So build in those pieces where they can present a little bit prior to maybe the deadline. Also, if the ultimate goal is that they learn it, even if it is a summative assessment, leave room for reassessment, because you're going to get evidence of where they are in their learning process, and don't miss the opportunity to dialogue about that evidence and provide timely and substantive feedback to them about their learning. When we're talking about assessment, I love this quote that you're looking at now, and shifting the mindset from quality control to quality assurance. The more we can invite our students into their own learning and honor their unique learning styles, the more it will be relevant to them, and they'll be able to see where they fit in to the learning community and to the objectives that we're trying to meet. And so that right there is very, very important. The more we can invite them in, we almost act as the lead learner, but really we're kind of helping and overseeing the learning process as they're going through it, as our students are asking good questions and as they're maybe stubbing their toe along the way, but then falling forward. But those whole discussions about this lifelong learning, you're the lead learner, and just kind of assuring that it's there for the student to be successful, and how can we help them along the way. Couple things when we're talking about those checkpoints, some things that I found very helpful to check where they are in the moment. The notion of an exit ticket. So we get done with the lesson for the day, and before the student leaves or before we transition to another subject, we allow the students, we give them a prompt, allow them to write their thoughts, allow them to give the answer and turn those in. We don't discuss them in the moment, but we have a chance before we meet again to look at what the students wrote, how they responded to our prompt. And that can be very, very formative for us with regard to how well did we convey the information. Did they learn what we wanted them to take from the way we structured the lesson that day? And so those exit tickets allow for us to look. And if we have several students that are maybe questioning the same thing or falling short of what we wanted them to take from that, we can lead back in with the next class with those very things without addressing it directly, but jumping back into that. So that way they know that you've read that, you know that you've taken their concerns and their questions to heart, and that we're coming right back into that to honor this learning and to jump right back into the learning process. Another thing that can take place during a lesson is quick writes. Just a moment of self-reflection. What are they taking from this? What are the things that, as we're presenting this, as we're doing this hands-on, what are the things that I'm learning right now? And just give them a couple minutes to write. And then with an elbow partner or someone across the room from them, when we pair up, give them each a minute and make sure they each have their opportunity to speak. And not only is that giving them an opportunity to voice their learning, but it's giving them the opportunity to be better active listeners and to hear what their classmate took from it. And that also opens up new avenues or new pathways. Hey, I never thought of that. Or, hey, I thought the same thing. What if this? And so those things, those quick writes and discussions in the moment can be very powerful, formative. And then finally, anytime the students can use cooperative learning techniques, maybe it's quiz trade where they have the question in front of them, they ask their classmate, and there they have the answer, but they ask the classmate, and the classmate gets to explain the answer to that question. If their partner's having trouble with that, then that's when tip, teach comes in. You don't give them the answer, you give them a clue. You give them a tip and they go, oh, that's right, that's what we were talking about. Or if after a couple tips they're saying, I'm still not sure I understand that, then that gives the student who has the original question an opportunity to reteach. And they're hearing it from a different voice. They're hearing it from a different vantage. They're hearing it from a peer, and that cements that learning. And if you can teach it, you've learned it. And that's very, very important. Finally, with regard to this idea of assessment, remember that there's more than one way to exhibit understanding. And so when we talk about inviting students in, the more we can allow them voice and choice in the way they want to exhibit their learning, the way that they want to engage with the subject matter, the product that they want to produce that meet those competencies, that student voice and choice is very powerful. And you can give overarching guidelines for how they'll be assessed, provide them a rubric, but give them the open space to fill themselves into it, to let their learning style be honored, and to let them know that the way they think, the way they learn, the way they produce is every bit as valued as those that are also in the class, and that there's more than one way to exhibit understanding. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about assessment, about feedback, and how that exhibits a love of learning, and how in the classroom, you're the lead learner. I'm sure that you entered into this profession, this vocation, because you had a love for learning and that you want to help students along their lifetime journey of learning. So when we think of assessment, build those times in where the student can be successful, where you can monitor their learning, where you can dialogue about it, and where you can learn from each other. Thank you very much, and best of luck when you're starting in your learning community. Thank you.